So there are things that I learned in my first few years of transition that I wish I had known about in the early days, or at least could have articulated. And that's what this is about. Hi squad, welcome/welcome back, and dog, bless you. Yes, my hair has basically gained sentience since I saw you last. I made this video to hopefully help out trans people who just came out, are getting ready to come out, or are starting the process of transitioning, whatever that might look like for them. Depending on your identity and experiences, some of this might be applicable and some might not. We are a very diverse community of people. I tried to keep things a little bit more general, but some of these talking points do go back to dysphoria, which is not a universal trans experience, and I need to stress that. It is, however, something that a lot of trans people find is a problem for them, particularly in the early days, particularly when they've just come out, and it's also something that I experienced, so it's something that I can speak to. It is important to stress, though, that it is not essential to transness. It is not something that every single trans person is going to live through, and it's not something that every single trans person is necessarily fixated on. I just wanted to make sure that I put that right up at the front, so I didn't have to drop a caveat every time it comes up. Also because it's important. So, yeah. Let's get rolling. First and foremost, you are not too late. There is no such thing. The absolute best time to transition is when you are ready, regardless of whether or not those barriers are physical, social, or psychological. Over the past few years, we've seen an influx in the number of young trans people coming out and seeking resources, which is awesome. There are a lot of really, really positive implications there, and also it's just really nice to see people coming out and being themselves and getting the care that they need. However, one of the kind of negative side effects of this is that it's kind of contributed to this idea of a set timeline, particularly whether or not it's worth it to come out and transition as an adult. I have straight up had people lament to me that they're worried it's too late for them to start HRT at 20 years old. I began my medical transition at 29. Just so we're clear. I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but it is never too late to be yourself. The absolute best timeline for your transition is the one that lets you do it. Maybe you're in your teens and seeking puberty blockers. Maybe you're in your 50s with your first grandchild on the way and you're finally feeling like it's time to prioritize yourself and get that name and wardrobe update that you've really been wanting, the one that will help reflect who you actually are. It is a disservice to yourself and other trans people to feed this idea that there even is a too late. It can feel like you've lost time, particularly if you've stayed quiet for the sake of other people. And it is important to process those feelings. But it is equally as important to make sure that mourning that lost time does not interfere with the time you still have. That is definitely something I wish I had understood sooner. Expanding on point number 1, there is no rush, no template, and there are no requirements. You may feel compelled to try and get as many transition-related things done and out of the way as quickly as possible, but you really don't have to do that, especially if it feels overwhelming. You are allowed to take all the time you need to consider whether or not a specific option, like HRT, is something that you actually want and is right for you. Anyone who argues that you're not really trans unless you're doing XYZ can help themselves to a heaping serving of minding their own damn business, because your transition is about you. Related point, your name is also about you. I made a very rushed decision on that front. I went with not a name that I necessarily wanted, but one that the people around me liked because I wanted it to be as comfortable for them as possible, given all of the changes that I was going through. And I do have some regrets on that front. I've warmed up to it now. It's not a bad name. I like the name. I love the name Finn. I think it's wonderful, but it wasn't really my choice. That said, arguably having a name that other people like more than you do is a pretty common experience. But I do wish I'd at least centered my preferences over everyone else's. So don't feel bad about changing your name, or wanting to trial run a bunch of different names. It's a pretty big decision, and you're allowed to take time to think about it. If there's one that's been on your mind for a while and feels particularly appealing to you, follow that, regardless of what other people say. Everyone's going to have an opinion. If you're not entirely sure, or you're caught between a bunch of different options, try using them as online screen names. You can also use them for takeout orders or sign up for an email subscription using one of them. Hearing a name called out in a restaurant or coffee shop, or seeing it on a receipt, or seeing an automated message use it to address you via email is a way more low-stakes way to try it out. I understand that it can be a little bit awkward to ask people to use different names multiple times over, so these options kind of let you explore if you're in the sampling phase without necessarily having to put yourself out there over and over again. Another good thing to keep in mind is that you do not owe anyone any specific gender performance based on the stereotypes and expectations around your identity. All people have different mosaics or scales of masculinity, femininity, and androgyny, and you are now in a much better place to explore what that should look like for you. You already did your gender performance. You don't need to do another one. Not unless you want to, in which case go ham, just, make sure it's for you. Because transition is about finding out what aspects of gender feel right by your standards, not other people's. Living in the closet is hiding ourselves and modifying our behaviors because of the people around us. This often primes us with a sense of responsibility for other people's feelings and reactions. So it bears mentioning that you are not a therapist, unless you are, but if so, then you already know the dangers and limitations of acting as a therapist to your friends and family, especially if you are at the center of whatever complicated feelings they need to get through. Something I wish I'd been better at when I came out was setting boundaries and not constantly feeling like I needed to explain myself, because I often wasn't able to. Having a list of resources to send to other people when they're leaning on you can be incredibly helpful, but so is understanding that it's not your responsibility to make other people get it in the first place. Now, it can feel like it is, especially if they're constantly coming to you with their associated struggles, and in doing so, making them the primary sources of stress in your transition process. Some of wanting to do that work is just wanting to be left alone, and that is entirely fair. But being trans doesn't make you an expert on the psychology, mechanisms, or history of transness any more than having a heart makes you a cardiologist. Your loved ones need to understand that. You need to understand that, and you are allowed to draw that line. Unless you actually are an expert on all things trans, you're still learning as well, and you don't have to understand every single minutia of the trans experience to have a trans identity. While we're on this topic, and this is by far the longest point, I really want to stress how important it is to put yourself first and not compromise. Now, I'm not saying be an asshole. There are non-confrontational ways to set boundaries, and generally those work a lot better. But it can be tempting to make concessions to make things easier for the people around you, usually in the hopes that it'll make things a little bit more easy on you in this moment. Something I wish I'd known sooner, though, is that making concessions in the present can create problems in the future. The most obvious examples that come to mind are names and pronouns. For some of us, it can be tempting to do a sort of soft assertion on this front. Something like, my name's Lena, my pronouns are she, her, but you might mess up sometimes and that's okay. My advice? Don't do that. I did that, and it was actually a cis person in my life who clued me into the problem there. When I told him I was transitioning and what my name and pronouns were, I said, but it's okay if you mess up, I get it. His response? No, it's not. You deserve basic decency, and if doing my best isn't good enough, then I'll do better. People who understand know that it isn't okay to refer to you incorrectly. They are going to make the effort either way, and mistakes do not need to be cleared in advance. They'll probably happen from time to time, and that's okay, because they will get better with time and practice, because these people want to get better at it. Conversely, people who don't understand or are resistant to your truth hear this preemptive excuse and immediately go into low effort mode. Don't validate the idea that it's a hard adjustment, because it shouldn't be. People adapt to new titles all the time, often eagerly so, like in the case when somebody gets married or completes a PhD and gets to slap doctor in front of their name. Transition, too, should be celebratory. You might excuse frequent misgendering and dead naming because alleviating present stress at the cost of future comfort is the best thing for you right now, depending on what you're dealing with. But months down the line, when you are correctly getting she-heard in a public place or at a party, and Sebastian Fricklepickle drops a he on you, it can not only really suck, it can also be potentially dangerous. Ideally, people will do the mental and verbal practice on their own, because it will take time to update the neural pathways that they associate with you. Something I found really helpful here was encouraging people rather than doing the preemptive excusing or responding negatively when they messed up. It's really easy to do that. Just tell people how it feels when they refer to you correctly. When you use my chosen name, it makes me feel so happy. Or hearing those pronouns brightens my day. Doing this gives them an association between referring to you correctly and feeling good, so they're more likely to revisit that. And for those who make no effort whatsoever, there's always the power move of just pretending that they're talking to somebody who doesn't exist, because they kinda are. Keep it up, Sebastian, you'll look like a fool. I am sorry to any Sebastians who are watching this, by the way. Hashtag not all Sebastians. To summarize this point, You have spent enough time playing a role for other people's comfort. With how much you've already compromised, it can feel like you're taking something from others by simply expecting basic respect. All you're doing is reclaiming space that was never anybody else's to take in the first place. They might struggle to understand that, but what's important is that you understand it, because it's true. You gave up years of your personhood for their comfort, so they can mildly inconvenience themselves by learning a new name for yours. Trust me. It only feels like asking a lot because of how much of yourself you were forced to give up before now. Moving on. Connect with other trans people. And by golly, connect with a diverse group of them if you can. There is an understandable tendency to associate only with people who share your identity, and sometimes this is justified, like if you are a trans person of color and you are trying to avoid the overwhelming whiteness of a lot of trans spaces. More generally though, make sure that you are reaching out to trans people of other genders, because they can offer resources and perspectives that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And for the love of dog, talk to trans people who are at varying points in their transitions. Being newly out and being surrounded only by other people who are newly out runs the risk of everybody's cumulative exhaustion culminating into some kind of exhaustion demon. It's a lot less daunting to scale a mountain when you're connected with the people at the camps on various points of the slope. That's not a perfect analogy. There's no one summit. Everyone's summit is going to look different, but you get what I'm saying. Look for people who are 2 years, 5 years, 10 years into transition, and talk to them. Discord is a really great place to do this, and don't be afraid to kind of shop around and check out the vibe of different servers and see what's up and who's there. I bring up online spaces first as they tend to be the most accessible, especially for people who live in places where it might not be safe to be out and trans. However, if you are able to connect with trans people in real life, I highly recommend doing so. Look into whether or not your hometown has a pride organization, and if you're a student, most schools have some kind of pride society. So connect with them. Those are both really great ways to meet other trans people. Branching off of that, ask how specific trans spaces make you feel. This is especially true for the ones that you access on your computer from the comfort of your own home. For example, if you deal with dysphoria, ask yourself if being surrounded by other incredibly dysphoric people is going to help you. This warrants repeating, because specifically seeking out validation for your negative feelings is an act of psychological self-harm. If you are purposely surrounding yourself with dysphoric people or watching a lot of trans cringe content, you may be psychologically self-harming. Many trans people have a lot of internalized transphobia and complicated feelings to unpack as we come out and transition, and a lot of us are really emotionally vulnerable for this reason. So every time you enter a trans space, ask what it is doing for you. Ask how you feel when you're there and how you feel when you leave. If you catch yourself dunking on other trans people to demonstrate that you're not like them, ask yourself what you're getting out of that and where that impulse comes from. This is another thing that I wish I'd been more mindful of the moment that I started questioning and seeking more information. I don't think I would have been pulled into transmedicalist thinking if I had just been a little bit more conscious of the spaces that I was accessing and the ways that they were making me feel. Had I been operating with a little bit more awareness, I wouldn't have lost so much time to self-hatred and pain. For reasons already mentioned, I am leery of the whole idea of wasted time, but I am pretty confident saying that any time spent on misery for its own sake was wasted. The sooner you learn to accept and celebrate your transness, and by extension other trans people, the more time you'll have to enjoy your truth. So right from the get-go, seek trans joy. Listen to people who love the fact that they're trans. Even if you yourself are not ready for those feelings yet, hear them out. Just consider them. Listen with the intent to understand rather than resist. You can also make a point of highlighting your own joy if you're still working towards self-acceptance. This could be anything from documenting a new hobby you now have the mental energy for since you are no longer consumed by the grueling process of 24/7 method acting. Or, keeping a journal of your euphoric moments. Reading that journal when you're feeling down or dysphoric can be a helpful reminder of your own happiness. It can help you remember that while the painful feelings are real, they are not constant. Now, this isn't to say you shouldn't feel your feelings. It's important to be able to work through the things that we're experiencing, regardless of whether or not they're positive or negative. But given the history of gatekeeping and the current social climate, there is a lot of outside pressure on trans people pushing us towards despair and pain. It can be really difficult to separate your own feelings of grief and sadness from the external forces driving you toward them. Learn to question where pain is originating from. That is, whether or not it's something that you need to address within yourself, or if it's something external to you that you could distance yourself from, such as a certain subreddit or a particular influencer. Number 8. Be careful with transition goals. Bellamy, who you should follow if you don't already, brought this up and I could not agree more. Now, transition goals can be really fun to joke about, but I've seen them stated seriously, even with an air of jealousy, a lot. It's really important to set realistic goals for yourself, goals that are based on you, because that's where you're headed. The version of yourself that is more in line with your correct gender. Your timeline, your journey is going to be completely unique to you, and that's a good thing. If you experience dysphoria, it can be hard to differentiate between that and the pressure of conventional beauty standards that impact everyone, trans and cis people alike. One of the ways that you can get better at telling the difference is to stop comparing yourself to other people. Something else that can help with this is to take a break from the camera. It can be incredibly tempting to take a bunch of pictures of yourself looking a certain way that validates your gender, and sometimes that can help, but sometimes it can backfire. Transition takes time. Getting to know yourself takes time. And if physical changes are part of the process for you, it can take a little bit for your brain to catch up even when they're happening. If you are on HRT, keep in mind that it's a gradual change. I know many people, myself included, who would frequently get into this headspace where you convince yourself that you've stagnated and no more changes are coming. That's usually a good cue to take a break from your appearance for a while. Learn to connect with yourself in other ways instead. I already anticipate a lot of people being mad at me just for saying this one, but learn to love your body. This is obviously a lot more easily said than done. I'm not telling you to just turn off your self-consciousness like a faucet. I know that's not how that works. But examine how you are approaching transition. Like, do you see it as fixing what's broken, or do you see it as customizing and reclaiming what's yours? A common coping mechanism for many closeted trans people is dissociation. So suddenly falling back into your body after years of distancing yourself from it would be jarring, even if it was the perfectly customized body of your dreams. A lot of us have to learn how to live in our bodies again, and what a healthy version of that actually looks like. So go slowly, and respect yourself. Try different clothes and hairstyles. Set yourself up with a skincare routine. Rekindle that relationship. Whether you're adjusting your style, progressing on HRT, or getting surgery, every single step you take in your transition should be affirming. It should feel right. And it's easier to tell what's right if you're checking in with yourself frequently and know what love for your body actually feels like. Bellamy also made this great point. I'm not sure specifically how to work it in. I just need to make sure that everyone sees it because she's right. Last, but certainly not least, I want to share some insights that were contributed anonymously by other trans people. I have several things that I wish I knew before I came out/transitioned. I wish I had more race-conscious trans resources. I'm an East Asian trans man, and I remember very few masculine makeup tutorials working for me because of my differing ethnic features, especially the eyes, and beauty standards. East Asian masculine beauty standards tend to be more feminine from a Western perspective, and I always felt like it put me in a weird position, especially as an Asian American, where leaning into them resulted in more Asian people seeing me as male and more white people seeing me as female. I just wish that were explained and explored more, both by myself and others. I also wish I hadn't treated transitioning like it would cure all of my problems. Sure, dysphoria was a huge cause of my depression, but it wasn't the only cause. And while transition did alleviate my dysphoria, it caused a bunch of new problems I didn't even think of. For me, the increased sex drive with testosterone has been the #1 stressor. Before T, I never had a sex drive at all, so while my doctor told me it would happen, I didn't even think about it because I didn't even have a concept of a sex drive at all. I've been sex repulsed all my life, so I've barely had sexual education or experience, and having to navigate it all on my own as an adult has been nothing short of a confusing, uncomfortable nightmare. And trying to accept that I just have sexual feelings/thoughts nowadays weighs heavily on me, and I still struggle with it. I feel like while transition has fixed my gender dysphoria, it's caused a weird sexual dysphoria. And while I don't regret transitioning at all, I do regret not making any efforts to be more educated on sex and sexuality. The idea that sexual orientation is easier or more fun to figure out than your gender identity isn't true, and I wish there were more discussions on the negatives of transition other than detransition, and just what lies on the other side of transition. This contributor brought up a number of important points, especially with regards to the overwhelming whiteness and representation not only with trans people, but masculinity. Which I know is a little bit weird coming from me. The point about transition not being a cure for all your problems is also very true. And even when transitioning is right for you, it can present new challenges. There's often a lot of pressure on trans people to not talk about these challenges because our critics are chomping at the bit to invalidate us. So I'll just go ahead and say it. You are not obligated to love or even like every single aspect of your transition. Like, I don't see anyone out here expecting cis people to absolutely love everything about themselves. You can and should talk about those things, and hopefully you're in a much better place to process them now that you're not experiencing this incongruence with your very self. The last comment I would like to read summarizes the complexities of the trans experience really well. There is pain in navigating the world as a trans person, and it's important to acknowledge both that that is real and that it comes from outside of ourselves. I wish that someone would have told me how difficult it would be to come to terms with some things and that you can only do so much about them. How difficult it is to come to terms that for some people in your life, you'll never be able to convince them of who you are, and that you'll never be able to have them see you as anything other than that person you were before. How difficult it is to come to terms that some people who you looked up to would rather have you dead than who you are now. How difficult it is to come to terms that not everyone is going to take your coming out well, even those you truly believed would be safe. How difficult it is to come to terms that you might be trapped in the closet, unable to be yourself, in any space you aren't completely sure is safe. How difficult it is to come to terms with the fact that in some places you will just never be safe to be yourself, and no matter how much you love the area or the people, you just can't risk being there. I wish someone would have told me about the kind people out there, and the sheer amount of love you can have or experience, and that you just need to look for them. That there are people who are kind and genuine, and that you can absolutely love being who you are around. That there are people who will happily listen to you and talk to you about so many wonderful and great things relating to your gender and expression of it. And that there's just so much love in the world for people who are trans. I love who I am, and I wouldn't ever want to change it. I love the people who love who I am. I love a lot of the people who don't love who I am. And that's good. That is good, and that is wonderful, and that is beautiful. I just fall so deeply in love with everything a little too much, and that allows me to live my life happy, even with all the hardships that may come with it. Being trans is not an easy life, but it is beautiful, and it is special, and you are part of an incredibly formidable community that your presence strengthens. You make the world brighter by being in it. Never forget that. I hope this was helpful. Let me know in the comments section some of the challenges you faced, as well as some of the joy that you found, and I will see you next time. And as always, thanks for watching.